In this episode,
White evangelicals quite easily have turned the Bible into, as I say, an inexhaustible well of narratives that legitimize social arrangements that they prefer.
come and get it, friends. Episode number 4, Faith in the Fresh Vibe podcast. I am your host, Rohadi, coming at you from Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. No, we will not become the 51st state. Are you nuts? This is a serial season called Farewell Evangelicalism. This episode carries forward the conversation from episode 3, which was a conversation on conspiracy theory. We're going to take it a step further now and make sense of how you apply conspiracy theory to form and shape evangelicals as a whole. Because evangelicals, it's a wide group. There are no set beliefs, yet somehow it's possible to take the vast majority and have them believe in the same things. How do you do it? Propaganda. That's where we're going in this episode, featuring the voices of Scott Coley and D.L. Mayfield. Now, why are we spending so much time on conspiracy theories, which was episode 3, and propaganda, which is episode 3, definitely this episode, and a little bit of episode 5 as well? Once we learn the how and why conservative Christians buy into damaging beliefs and theologies that harm vulnerable people and themselves, connecting them to the political aspirations that seek to preserve the power of white supremacy and patriarchy, folks still in, leaving, or who have left evangelical church traditions will develop the language to make sense of all the weird as you pursue your ultimate freedom and liberation. We begin the episode with Scott Coley, who will share excerpts from his research, also available in book form, called Ministers of Propaganda. The conversation then shifts gears in the second half with one of the most powerful examples of effective propaganda. The organization? It's called Focus on the Family. Bringing their research and expertise will be D.L. Mayfield. Now, content warning. The second half deals with child abuse because it's Focus on the Family. It also has a ton of swearing, just in case you're listening and suddenly an F-bomb drops. But after all, if you're more offended by swearing than Focus on the Family, you're in the right place, but you got some work to do. Let's jump straight in with this conversation with Scott Coley.
All right, my name is Scott Coley. I have a PhD in philosophy, and I was on the philosophy faculty at a liberal arts college for about 10 years. And so I'm an author, a professor, and a consultant. And I've recently written a book called Ministers of Propaganda, Truth, Power, and the Ideology of the Religious Right. I live in central Pennsylvania, which is an area that came to be inhabited by the Susquehannock Indians in and around the 16th century.
Now, if you remember from episode 1, I made a joke about the scandal of the evangelical mind, which isn't a joke at all. It's the title of a book. We start our conversation by bringing it up again. It had some insight where, I think it was written in 94 or something. I was like, right. Oh my, this book could have been written now. This was like what, 20, that's 25 years, isn't it?
Yeah. So
30, almost
Erdman's
30.
actually just released a new edition of it.
Oh, with like
Yep.
new data?
No, there was no data. I mean, that's sort of the point. There's no new data, right? I mean, the central argument of the book is still salient. Now, I mean, we could, there are discussions to be had about whether the book deals adequately with sort of social aspects of things, social practices,
sure.
Which is something that my book deals with. I mean, the book was it was regarded as pretty unsparing and hard-edged when it came out.
Now, if you remember from episode 1, the reason why we're interrogating evangelicalism and conservative Christianity is because they are the largest religious voting bloc in America and hold a lot of sway. Their beliefs are also exported. So Canadian evangelicals also don't have a unique thought. They import their beliefs from America largely. American evangelicalism is exported all across the world. So we need to break down the evangelical mind to ascertain how we were brought to this point of chaos.
I think that's a great place to situate the argument of the book and to sort of contrast my argument with, let's say, an argument that I would have made, say, 10 years ago if I had set out to analyze the kinds of problems that I pick up in the book. So one way of putting the basic problem that I try to analyze is, why is it that so many conservative white evangelicals appear to inhabit an alternate reality?
Yeah, sure.
And if I had written this book, say, 10 or so years ago, I probably would have said something like this. Conservative white evangelicals, hereafter I'll just say evangelicals, and by the way, I mean in the American context, probably what I would have said, a decade ago is something like this. Evangelicals favor problematic social arrangements and political policies, morally problematic policies, because they're just not thinking clearly about, for example, the moral salience of institutions. They tend to focus on individual morality, individual piety, this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And they don't think, for example, about the moral valence of, say, economic institutions or institutional injustice, this kind of thing. And that's the problem. That's a big part of the problem in evangelicalism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, I still think that's true. Mm-hmm. I haven't abandoned that idea, but what I've come to recognize in researching this project and just sort of seeing what goes on, the last decade or so, is that is an incomplete picture of what's going on. Yes, it's true that evangelicals favor morally problematic policies and social arrangements because they're not thinking clearly. But it's also true, and it's equally important to notice, that part of the reason that evangelicals aren't thinking clearly is because they favor problematic policies and social arrangements. And in other words, there's a feedback loop between belief and practice. Yes, it's true that bad belief leads to bad practices, but it's also true that bad practices lead to bad beliefs. And this feedback loop is what I call ideology. An ideology sort of exists within a kind of ecosystem, right? You don't find ideology in a vacuum. Any ideology is based around some kind of social hierarchy. And that hierarchy could be based in race, could be based in gender, economics, some combination of the three, something else. As it happens, I talk about all three of those in my book. But ideology is based around perpetuating and propping up some kind of social hierarchy, whatever that hierarchy is. Human beings, in the face of some kind of social hierarchy, have a tendency to construct what we call legitimizing narratives. And a legitimizing narrative is what it sounds like. It's a narrative that legitimizes, in this case, some kind of social hierarchy. In the absence of a legitimizing narrative, social hierarchy is just a hierarchy. It's just some people have wealth, power, privilege, and so on, and other people are subjugated, disenfranchised, and impoverished. And without a legitimizing narrative, people tend to find these kinds of things unacceptable. Why do these people get to have stuff and these people don't? Why do these people have power and these people are subjugated? So a legitimizing narrative comes in and it provides a moral justification for whatever the preferred social hierarchy is. So you have, at the center of ideology, you have a social hierarchy, and then you could think of it sort of in concentric circles. You've got a hierarchy, and then you've got a legitimizing narrative that explains why the hierarchy is legitimate. And this is an important part of the feedback loop between belief and practice, right? So look at a prime example of this kind of a feedback loop that involves legitimizing narrative would be something like the interplay between racial segregation and white supremacy, say in the middle of the 20th century. Which isn't to say that this doesn't exist anymore, right? It's just to say that it was particularly clear at that moment and explicit. Say in the Jim Crow South. I mean, this was happening all over the U.S., but just to take it a particularly explicit example, let's say the Jim Crow South in the first half of the 20th century.
Okay.
You have a belief, white supremacy, that leads to a particular kind of practice, namely racial segregation, the consequences of which appear to justify the original belief in white supremacy, right? Because, of course, if you bar people of color from accessing the accoutrement of wealth and success via racial segregation, then that's going to appear to confirm white superiority, right? Never mind that you're establishing social conditions that guarantee this particular kind of outcome, right? Okay, well, what's the legitimizing narrative why say that, apart from these sort of consequences that are cited in support of white superiority, what evangelicals did was they went to the Bible to provide legitimizing narratives that were meant to morally justify racial segregation. And there's a whole history there of interpretation in, the book of Genesis, for example, going back to theological justifications for race-based chattel slavery. So a central line of argument in my book is that white evangelicals have effectively turned the Bible into an inexhaustible well of legitimizing narratives that prop up and perpetuate social arrangements that benefit themselves, often to the detriment of historically marginalized groups.
Well, let's continue with the pillars, because you have ideology, but then you roll ideology into the mechanism onto, bringing folks into the subculture, and you name it as propaganda.
Right. So propaganda comes in many different forms. You find propaganda in film, in other kinds of art, in oration. I deal with a particular kind of propaganda in my book, and that is rhetoric that appeals to some ideal. Could be an intellectual ideal, a moral ideal, political ideal, theological ideal. It's rhetoric that appeals to some ideal in service to an agenda that undermines that very ideal. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One example would be the way in which the defender of chattel slavery in the antebellum South appealed to the political ideal of liberty in defense of race-based chattel slavery. This perhaps sounds absurd to you. I hope it does. It should, right? But as I say, these things exist in an ecosystem. So propaganda is couched within ideology. So according to the ideology of white supremacy on which this institution of race-based chattel slavery was based, some people owned property and some people were property. And so outlawing slavery, abolishing slavery, was tantamount to depriving some people of the liberty to own a certain kind of property, which just happened to be other human beings. I mean, we now recognize, of course, that, and it was recognized at the time, that one of the principal arguments against the institution of chattel slavery, race-based or otherwise, one of the principal arguments against chattel slavery is that it violates the political ideal of liberty by depriving people of their liberty. But if within a particular ideology, one can appropriate, a particular ideal, in this case, the ideal of liberty. What makes this kind of propaganda so potent is that if I can appropriate that ideal, then you don't get to use it to argue against my position, right? Because liberty's on my side.
Ooh.
Yeah. Same thing with, to take another example that I discuss at length in the book, because I think it's really important to the deterioration of, evangelicals' perception of reality.
I asked Scott to give us another example, and now we turn the page to fundamentalism, who are not that different than evangelicals, at least for our purposes here.
So again, you have an ideal that is appealed to in service of an agenda that undermines that very ideal. Creation science evokes the ideal of scientific rigor, scientific method. Science, it's science, right? In service to a set of institutions and industry and agenda, the whole purpose of which is to undermine legitimate science. Because they've appropriated that ideal, the sort of lay observer, particularly one who's already inclined to this kind of ideology, they say, well, you've got creation creation scientists and then, sort of conventional establishment scientists, and they disagree about sciencey stuff. Who's to say who's right? I guess I'm just going to go with the people I am inclined to agree with. But it's just scientists arguing with each other. When in fact, it's not scientists arguing with each other. There's scientists, and there's the creation science industry that aims to undermine science.
Now it's time for more specifics. What is it about white evangelicalism that makes them so susceptible to all of these malformed inputs?
It's, as I say, ideology, legitimizing narratives, propaganda. Another important factor here is what's called motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning, again, I mean, it's sort of what it sounds like. It's reasoning that is motivated by one's self-interests. It's the reason why we expect judges and referees to be neutral. We expect judges to recuse themselves from cases where their material interests might be impacted by the outcome of a given case, not because we assume that the judge lacks integrity. Maybe the judge has integrity, maybe they don't. But the point is that even a judge that has integrity shouldn't preside over a case that affects their material interests, because your very perception of reality is subject to the effects of motivated reasoning. So you've got a social hierarchy that benefits, certain people. You've got legitimizing narratives, which I argue white evangelicals tend to take from the resources of Christian theology. That's influenced by motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning prompts us to accept legitimizing narratives that are actually quite shoddy and unsupported, right? Why does anyone believe that this is true? Well, because they want it to be true, because it benefits them, right?
Yeah, the material benefit there is the linchpin. I mean, I can't think. Well, I suppose that there would be some additional intersections there beyond the material benefit. But man,
well, it could be any kind of benefit, and it could even be a way of justifying the let's say the wealth that you already have. An important thing that's going on here is a method of biblical interpretation that I call the hermeneutics of legitimization. This is the means by which white evangelicals pull legitimizing narratives out of the Bible. And the hermeneutics of legitimization has, I argue, three pillars that tend to show up. One is proof texting. I don't think I need to tell you what that, your listener, what that is, right? Taking a passage out of context to suit a particular purpose. But you've got proof texting. That's one pillar. Another is what I call motivated literalism. And the idea there that sort of evokes motivated reasoning. But motivated literalism is when you read the Bible in what you claim is the plainest, sort of most straightforward sense, but only when doing so doesn't threaten your material interests. So motivated literalism, that's the reason why someone like John MacArthur insists that you have to read the first few chapters of Genesis to mean that the earth was created in 6 24-hour days a few thousand years ago. But then when it comes to Christ's admonitions about wealth, all of a sudden things get very complicated, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of interpretation.
Yeah, and if you want to have
very contextual,
if you want to have your mind blown, right? I mean, just look at the way that John MacArthur reads the parable of the Good Samaritan. But spoiler alert, when Christ says go and do likewise, he doesn't actually mean that. But Genesis 1 and 2 are perfectly simple. And the third pillar, so you've got proof texting, motivated literalism, and finally, and this is key, is the paradigm of authority and submission. So when you approach a text, one of the questions you have to ask is, what is this about? What is this text about? What is this book about? What is this whatever? What is it about? And according to the paradigm of authority and submission, one of the central questions that the Bible sets out to answer is which humans should have power and which humans should submit. And so you combine those three things, right? Proof texting, motivated literalism, and the paradigm of authority and submission. And you can see how white evangelicals quite easily have turned the Bible into, as I say, an inexhaustible well of narratives that legitimize social arrangements that they prefer.
So easy, yet,
I mean, how could you not do that when that's how you read the Bible? Or any text for that matter?
well, any text you could apply these components here, and now it becomes dangerous when you can use these pieces to push ahead such an obtuse yet powerful set of not merely reasons, but you can mobilize folks towards malformed power,
right,
and do what you need to do to keep it.
Right. And as I argue in the last chapter of the book, I think a common perception is that the problem with fundamentalism is that it's too rigid. Because fundamentalists, I think it's fair to say the perception is that fundamentalists are just too dogmatic and rigid about things.
Yeah.
Fundamentalists tend to be rigid, but I think we need to couch that, right, in an understanding of this sort of technique of knowledge that's at play here, right? I would argue that the problem with fundamentalism is that infinitely flexible, right? Because you can make the Bible say whatever you want. And the trouble with fundamentalism, right, is that they decide that the Bible says a particular thing that happens to be self-serving, and then that serves as a pretext to not change your mind in the face of moral argument.
As you were describing these components, it's easy to lose a sense of hope, especially when you think about a loved one who may be part of that world. It sounds like a cycle that can't be broken. It's that nefarious. It's so effective in that sense. How would you describe solutions? How does one get out of the feedback loop, or even simply become alert to the feedback loop?
Everyone is susceptible to the pull of ideology, motivated reasoning, and so on. So I think there are sort of two questions here, right? One of which is, how can you know that, let's say you're more progressive or on the political left or liberal or however you want to put it, right? How do you know you're not doing the exact same thing that people on the other side are doing, right?
That's an easy criticism.
Right, right.
Yeah.
To that, I would say this. I would say, look, we're all susceptible to these dynamics, but there's at least one important difference between what I'm doing and what the people I'm arguing against do. And that difference is this. The kinds of social arrangements and political policies that I advocate for don't benefit me materially. That's not to say that you're necessarily wrong if you're, let's say you're a member of a group who's suffered injustice.
Yeah.
Right. But even then, I think the pull of the moral argument is not, look at me, look at how you're treating me. Right. So, I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King, he didn't go around talking about how he'd been wrong. Right. He was, I don't know, maybe he did. I haven't, obviously I don't know all the remarks that he ever made. But the force of his argument was that he was arguing on behalf of a group of people that were that were subject to systemic injustice. So yeah, I mean, if in that case, it may be that the demands of justice just happen to serve one's own interests. But the point is not that it's serving one's interests. The point is that it's about justice. That ties very neatly, I think, into what I would say about how to become attuned to how these different factors may contribute to one's perception of the world. And that would be this. There's sort of two threads that I don't really state them explicitly, right? But I think they sort of run through the book, and I think they sort of come out of the arguments of the book. One theological and one more political. And I've had more conservative friends who've read the book suggest to me that they find this compelling. And I don't want to oversell it, right? We're not talking about hard right, but we're talking about, we're talking about that one who is sincerely working out their faith with fear and trembling, and who sincerely desires to follow Christ and emulate the example of Christ, should find the following kinds of arguments compelling. So the theological argument is basically this. If you are a Christ follower and you sit down to read the Bible and you consistently come away with interpretations of the text according to which you're doing everything right and you should have all the wealth and power, and the people who disagree with you are all wrong and they should be poor and subjugated, you're probably not reading the Bible correctly. That's not a good way to use the Bible or read the Bible. So, and the second point is this, and it's a similar point to do with politics. When you go into the voting booth, you could imagine a couple different kinds of motivation for voting in a certain, this or that way. One motivation is this. And sadly, I think this is sort of an assumption of American politics, is that what everyone's doing. And I don't blame the Christians for this. I don't blame Christian nationalists for this. Most Americans tend to think that way. That's a longer conversation, a deeper problem in our polity, though Christians are certainly complicit in it. Anyway, one kind of motivation is this. You ask yourself, which politician or party or platform is going to enact policies that benefit me and people like me? And then you vote for that person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're all just a bunch of different special interest groups. As I say, Christians are definitely in the United States, conservative evangelicals are certainly complicit in viewing politics this way. But I wouldn't say that they're sort of responsible for this situation.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not a good situation. And they've certainly had a hand in exacerbating the problem. Here's a very different motivation that might inform your thinking politically. You go into the voting booth and you ask yourself, which politician or party or platform is going to bring our laws and public policies and economic institutions into greater conformity with the objective truth about what people deserve and what we owe to each other? In other words, justice. And then voting for that. I would argue that that is what Christians ought to be doing. And in fact, we're well positioned to set an example for our fellow citizens.
Thank you very much, Scott, for sharing your expertise on propaganda. We've spent 2 episodes now naming systems. It's time for us to pull apart an actual organization that is conducting the harm, something that is recognizable. And unfortunately, the name of the organization is so prolific because it has proliferated across North America and the world. Anywhere conservative Christianity touches, focus on the family is there. I invite D.L. Mayfield to come and share a little bit about their research around the Strongwilled Child, about all things James fucking Dobson.
Hi, I'm D.L. Mayfield, and I am located in the traditional lands of the Cascades and Cowlitz tribes, otherwise known as the outer southeast part of Portland, Oregon. And I am a writer and a podcaster who is very obsessed with a man named Dr. James Dobson and the parenting principles he kind of spread throughout the world, thanks to an organization called Focus on the Family. And I'm, an evangelical. I have known you a little bit on the mean streets of social media.
Hey,
for
that's
a few
my line
years now. Oh, and it's nice to be here, like seeing you like your actual face and chatting with you.
Ditto. The pleasure is all mine. Hello, welcome. Let's talk about James fucking Dobson. I'll have to put the explicit lyric on this one. I wasn't sure if I should actually say that because, it could be offensive. It's offensive to some. But
I love swearing. So if you are giving me like the thumbs up to swear, I'm gonna do it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just put explicit on. I think you have to do that. Do you? I don't know.
You
Let's,
don't.
Yeah, we do that. I will match where you're going. I usually well, first off, I swear nonstop in my head, but out loud I'll swear more with Christians because Christians don't swear. But for all my friends who do swear, I'm just like, no, I will be the opposite.
I don't need to. Yeah. Oh yeah, that little thing within you. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I should say, it sounds like you have a bit of a strong-willed child in you. And that is the name of my most recent podcast and Substack project. It is actually called Strong-Willed because you know what is like the most annoying thing to authoritarian dictators? It's people who have a strong will. Why they try to crush early and often political regimes, and why they perpetuate child raising materials that encourage parents to do the same thing. So if you have that bit of a strong-willed child in you, which we all do, it's time to nurture that baby. It's time to nurture that strong-willed child. This is our moment. This is our time. That's my little message to start off with.
Thank you. And outro, fade to black. End of episode. Totally.
That's it. We did it.
Affirmations. Bathe me in affirmations of being a strong-willed child. Now, as we enter into this conversation, I encourage you, dear listener, if you have to pause it because your body recoils from some of the things we are naming, go ahead and do that. Okay, let's jump back in as we name, focus on the family as a primary tool to disseminate propaganda.
Well, I have a few ways. So I've been reading books by Dr. Dobson for many years now. I have been obsessed with white evangelicals for decades now. I was a Christian writer in that world. I was born to an evangelical pastor, was homeschooled, went to a Bible college, got my fucking degree in like being a colonizer because I did the missions program.
Oh, yeah. Ooh.
It's a lot. That is my background. Eventually, right, I became a progressive Christian. I was like, whoa, none of these people, including my parents, seem to actually care what Jesus said, but I was autistic. I took it very literally, being indoctrinated day in and day out to take the words of Jesus seriously. And I was like, oh my God, Jesus is like, let's overthrow, the social order, and the poor should be prioritized and the rich should be sent away empty. And I'm like, yeah, let's do that, Then obviously that it's right here, mom and dad. And guess what? They didn't give a rat's ass about that. And I had to deal with that. And part of what makes this so difficult to talk about how you were raised, if you were raised in something similar to white evangelicalism, which didn't just impact white people, but we can get into why it's important for me to name the whiteness at the root of all of this. But if you were raised like this, for one, nobody wants to unpack their childhood, just across the board. Nobody wants to be like, hey, maybe some of that was shitty. Okay, there's just no good reason to do that. Secondly, if you're raised in something like white evangelicalism, if your parents utilize Dr. Dobson methods, there is so much of the propaganda is directly tied to goodness, right? Like we are good people with good morals, with good parenting strategies. We're close knit, and it's like we're close knit, but really it's controlling. It's like they use so much of this language to kind of get it into your head. So my project Strongwilled is looking at what my partner and I, Crispin, are calling religious authoritarian parenting methods. And it's really important to keep religious and authoritarian together. But basically, we're looking at materials such as the one that made Dr. James Dobson famous. His first book was published in 1970. It was called Dare to Discipline. And it was basically giving parents in America this advice that if you don't want your kids turning into liberals, if you don't want them protesting in the streets against Vietnam or for civil rights or for the rights of women, then you got to spank the shit out of them, right? You got to dare to discipline. And when you do that, when you discipline your kids, you tie it directly to your own personal faith in Jesus and God. And you tell your child as you're hurting them, every time they assert their will is when Dobson said you had to spank the kid, right? Anytime they assert their will and it's in opposition to the parent's will, you must hurt your child and say, I'm doing this because I love you and I love God. And this is what God does. God punishes those he loves. This is the only way to love you, the only way to help you. So I'm coming to this conversation just knowing like that's the backbone of this whole thing is teaching kids to equate abuse with love and control with love. And if you grow up in that, if you're getting spanked as a 2-year-old every time you assert your own will, when you get older, you don't remember that. Actually, like conscious memory starts forming around 4.5, 5 years old for most people. So you have a lot of folks running around out here who have no memory of this being imprinted into their actual nervous systems and their bodies. But, they've been trained and programmed from birth, not only just to immediately comply with authority and immediately suppress your own will, right, in the face of authority. They're also like, but this is the best way to do it. And my parents are the most loving people. And the church that taught them to do this is the only place where you can understand morals and goodness. And it's just like, whoa, it's all connected. It's all connected.
I think of all the folks who got their ass beat by their parents in the name of God. And I think of now a generation of kids, and there are generations now, but the generation of kids who first came out of that are adults now, have had their own kids. And I don't know if you've tracked the numbers on this, but a lot of folks, A, are in therapy now, but B, completely left their churches as a direct result of the abuse that they endured in the name of God.
I don't know about the numbers. I actually think, now we can have a conversation about this. I don't think very many people are leaving the church because of abuse they experienced as children. I think, again, there's these cultural like beliefs that what happened to me couldn't have been abuse. This wasn't child abuse. I just think if you don't come from this background and you read the works of Dr. Dobson, it is abuse. Like, there's no other way to say it. I just think most people I've talked to are not there yet. They tend to leave for other reasons. I will say that with Donald Trump winning a second, presidency in the United States, the sense I am getting from the culture, and I'm not as plugged in as I used to be online, but the sense I'm getting is people are leaving now, or they've been leaving this whole time. And now they're starting to be like, oh my God, being nice and trying to like respectfully cater to our parents or our church friends who have this ideology, right, that is also rooted in authoritarianism. Like, that hasn't worked. We've tried it for 8 years. It hasn't worked. And we have nothing left to lose anymore, because a huge pressure that culture puts on us, but also the church, right, is if you say something in a slightly intense way, then you're responsible for how the other person reacts. And we see this playing out politically all the time. Like, oh, leftists, you're being so mean to the conservatives, which is why they voted for Donald Trump. And that threat has been hanging heavy over the heads of people like myself, people who, again, I'm a millennial. I have my own kids. That was a huge wake up call for me. When I started parenting my kids, I was like, oh, I don't want to do any of the things my parents did for me. And sometimes I wonder, I'm like, if I didn't have kids, would I ever have unpacked that? I'm not sure. People who can unpack this stuff without going through the process of parenting, I'm like, damn, you are locked in and ready to do some work that sometimes seems to have been thrust upon me just because I had to make choices as a parent myself. And the longer I parented, the more I was like, oh shit, oh no, I think what happened to me wasn't great, and again, nobody wants to think that. We are biologically designed, right, to say my caregiver wants to take care of me. We have to think like that as little kids. There is no alternative, right? It is existential terror if you are a small child and you are like, wow, my parent is not taking care of me. So we are just biologically designed to do anything in our power as children to connect with our caregivers and believe that they have our best interests at heart. And the weird thing is, Dr. Dobson was a child psychologist and he knew that and he exploited that. And so he kind of taught this way of abusing kids where it wouldn't set off any red flags because he's like, we're spanking in a really logical and calm manner. You're explaining to your kid why you're doing it. You're not just like beating the shit out of your kid for no reason. Like, you tell them why you do it every single time. And at the end of you hurting them, you actually make them hug you and tell you how much they love you and how thankful they are for that correction. Like, it's like, this is so great. And there's no ill effects on kids at all. That's not true for one, but he said a lot of not true things. And so he's actually like embedding this psychological response where the kid has to say thank you for their abuse, like every time, and really internalize the idea that at their core, they are bad and deserving of punishment, right? Now, this gets into why were Dr. Dobson, he was a child psychologist. He really wanted the white patriarchy to continue on, was really upset about all the social progress movements in the 1960s. In the beginning, he didn't talk about God a ton, and then eventually, right, becomes this guru of Christians. And that's because his number one thing is kids need to be punished because they're sinful, because they're bad, because left to their own devices, they become tyrants, dictators, all these things. And that found a home in Christian theology, right, which has this idea of original sin. And then we're off to the races. And his original book, Dare to Discipline, was so successful. It sold so many millions of copies, right, that he was able basically to jumpstart Christian publishing as we know it, and then start an organization called Focus on the Family. So my big thing is like, everybody loves to argue about what is an evangelical, you know, like even in America, we're still trying to figure that out. And I'm like, all these churches across America, and I know this made its way to Canada as well, thanks to Christian publishing, thanks to these, you know, apparatuses that Dobson, so Dobson focused on radio and print media, right? These things mean he can disseminate his message throughout the world, throughout America. If you look at all these evangelical churches in the United States, and I bet in Canada too, right? There's a lot of theological differences people have, but they probably all parented their kids the same way. They probably all focused on the need for corporal punishment, for instilling, you know, discipline and respect for godly authority, right? And tying that to your Christian religion. And so I think that this is just such an understudied part of what makes an evangelical an evangelical. It's like, how do you discipline and indoctrinate your child is like the core root of it. And it's just not being talked about enough. Like, the reason I think it's so important to focus on someone like Dr. Dobson, the first half of his life, right, he was this child psychologist, this marriage and family therapist, right, giving advice. And then the second half of his life, he becomes basically the most prolific right-wing political lobbyist the United States has ever seen. I do not have enough time to list out every political lobbying organization he has started, been on the board of, helped found. I can't list out all the anti-LGBTQ plus bills that he personally helped come see to fruition. So he has been so successful, and the child psychology is directly related to the political activism. And he basically gave parents these tools that would create a population for him that would be predisposed to gleefully and loudly and proudly usher in a Christian authoritarian leader. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly, you know, he got his wish that he has been gunning for from the 1960s. In his office, he has this picture of Winston Churchill. This is when he was, you know, still the head of Focus on the Family.
Yeah.
And he views himself as the Winston Churchill of America. I think that's an important thing to say. He's like, I never ran for office. I never did any of these things where people could pinpoint it on me. But I will go down as history as someone who saved America. And by that, he means a white patriarchal America. He says, I will go down in history by abusing and indoctrinating children and then implementing a right-wing Christian authoritarian theocracy. And it's like, wow, he did both. He actually did both of those things. So
look at us now.
Let's talk about it.
Made it.
Hey, we're indoctrinated people. Okay. Here's where like the autonomy piece is very interesting to me. It's not that we're suckers. It's that the psychological impact of what happens to you as a child, like, is real. That doesn't mean we can't overcome it. And actually, that's why his second book was called The Strongwilled Child, because parents kept reaching out to him and were like, we're doing everything you say. And we still have this one kid in our family who, no matter how much we spank them, no matter how much we shame them, right, they won't obey us. And so then he was like, yeah, there's this like type of kid called the strong-willed kid that needs extra discipline. And so he wrote a whole book about the strong-willed children. And I think that's where our real power is. It's not that like some kids are just strong-willed. I think probably more accurate description is like there's some kids who their nervous system response is the fight response. And that's the most intense one that gets triggered, where others have fight. I mean, I just said fight. Others have freeze or fawn or flee. So you dissociate or you numb out or you acquiesce and act like they're the best people ever as like a survival mechanism, or you peace out. You know, there's all these different ways to respond. But I think that's so interesting is he knew it doesn't work on everyone. And authoritarian governments know that as well, which is why in the beginning, they try and punish people. Right now in the United States, we're seeing this happen with the trans community, and we're seeing this happen with the immigrant community. They're trying to punish both of these communities very visibly because, you know, both of them are supposedly threats, right? And they kind of are. They're threats to white patriarchal norms. So I guess I get that. But they're trying to make an example and punish these strong-willed, you know, individuals. The truth is, it's like, yeah, there's some of us, it's like, well, you can beat us all you want, but we're still going to keep being who we are. You know, he had this whole thing built into his system where it's like, if a kid doesn't respond well to my punishing methods, there's something horribly wrong with them. Later on, he'll tell parents, you just weren't controlling enough. You just didn't punish enough. And that's why your child eventually left the faith or didn't vote for a Republican or whatever. But it's kind of a neat trick he had to blame everybody except for his abusive system.
Here's the thing with abusive systems, and one like focus on the family that has existed for half a century, there's collateral damage. Now we are seeing the impact, the consequences of generations of parents using focus on the family tools to raise their kids, many of whom no longer adhere to the Christian faith because of the abuse that they incurred. One of the consequences that you may have noticed is the adult children now becoming estranged from their parents. We end this podcast with the question around estrangement.
Yeah, I think we've put out 3 podcasts now about estrangement, and they have, you know, by far been the most listened to things we've ever put out. And we've been podcasting for like 8 years. And we weren't even aware of this because you don't get a ton of feedback on podcasts, but like just the sheer amount of people who are downloading them and listening, I was like, whoa, this is obviously hitting a nerve, which again, I'm sort of thinking is related to this sort of sense I'm getting from people, which is like, okay, if the gloves are off, the gloves are off, right? If this is actually happening, what else do we have to lose? This is a sentiment I've heard from multiple people. What else do I have to lose at this point? Because for many of us, trying to be in relationship with people in our lives who are all in on Christian fascist ideology, it's exhausting. And you actually don't have the energy to invest in the communities that are working towards the kind of world you want to live in. If you're spending all of your time making Christian fascists feel like good people. That is the pressure they are putting on their children. That is the pressure they're putting on anyone who maybe is like, hey, so it's this incredible amount of pressure, which again ties back to these childhood experiences of being hurt by your parents. You have to end it by saying, I love you, mom and dad. I know you did this for my own good, right? And you're supposed to be grateful and kind of never puncture that image of I'm a really good person because I'm a Christian narrative. Now that narrative is being pummeled in so many ways. And so people are on high alert. And then when it comes a bit from their kids, it's just kind of some explosive stuff can happen. But I think people are finally at the point where it's like, wow, like I don't have anything else to lose because we don't actually have a relationship. Our parents, if they're still all in on this ideology, they don't want to know who we are as people. And that was never the goal. Ooh. The goal was you will comply to this role you were assigned at birth, because again, this is a white supremacist patriarchal movement. So if you are born female, you have some very specific roles to fulfill. If you're born male, you have some very specific roles to fulfill. And then it kind of extrapolates from there. But the Republican identity is really important. The always being obedient part is very important. And then the gender norms of whatever, sex you're assigned at birth are so important. And a lot of people are like, I do not have the energy to do this anymore. I'm a real person with real thoughts, real feelings, my own gender and sexual identity, right? Like my own political views. And all of that is such a threat to our parents if they come from this kind of system. And so I think that's where people are like, life is too short to keep doing this. Like, I deserve to be loved for who I am. And you know what? Every kid fucking deserves that, to be loved for who they are. If you are born into something like white evangelicalism, that is not what you get. And that is not the express purpose of it at all. You are supposed to replicate your parents' ideology. That is the number one role you're supposed to play in the world. And I just think, oh my God, if we're going to talk about like what comes next, where liberation is, I'm like, liberation is where children aren't being abused, where children are seen and loved for who they are and protected from folks who would abuse them and try and put them into these very rigid, narrow boxes just to uphold a white supremacist patriarchy. Like, no, this is the future of liberation, is we have to stop abusing children. And I know this is going to make people uncomfortable, but like, the Christian church in America in particular is like the biggest supporter of child abuse because it carries on its political and patriarchal aims. And I'm like, we've got to interrupt this. And again, I know why people don't want to talk about it. In the future, there's no reason to hit your kid. There's no reason to hit your kid to get them to do what you want them to do. Like, the research has been showing us this from the 1950s. So Dr. Dobson was well aware of all the research, right? About how damaging it is to kids when you use corporal punishment on them. There's so many horrible ramifications. Some of it is actually tied to child sexual abuse, which I don't think we can get into in here. But then there's also this component of hurting your kid and making your kid afraid of you, in order to get them to obey. It impacts the gray matter of their brain. And you know what some of the outcomes are when your gray matter is impacted in childhood? It makes you more likely to commit to a high control religion. It makes you paranoid. It gives you apocalyptic tendencies and fantasies. Like, you can look at what's going on in society and be like, almost everything we're seeing happen in society is actually one of the outcomes that comes from people being abused in childhood, being spanked in childhood. And then when you add on the spanking plus the religious component, I'm doing this because God says, it gets even worse and gets people who are easily manipulated, right? Deeper to say, this is what I deserve. This is actually what I long for. And, Tucker Carlson, all these people
this is what's
are now calling Trump Daddy Trump, Daddy Don, come to spank all the liberals.
That's not gross. Yeah. Dang.
It's so gross. And I'm not allowed to talk about this publicly, but it's incredibly gross. And I think if people could take a few steps back, they'd be like, wait a fucking minute. What is actually going on here with all these men writing all these books about spanking young children? You know what I'm saying?
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, DL, for coming through and holding it down on propaganda. We'll hear again from DL in future episodes. So what is Focus on the Family upholding? It's time for a deep dive. They are pillars of white supremacy and patriarchy. So why not just go there in the next episodes? Let's do it. Episode 5, Patriarchy, coming next. Daniel Weed on the outro.
Now the voices of those who escaped it ring out in the distance beyond the horizon line. They say, brother, your wounds aren't imagined, your pain not forgotten. Come find your way home. From all that's familiar into a journey uncertain, but it's better, I'm sure,